Ever since video games became popular, violence in video games has been a controversial topic. This issue can be traced back to the early days of video games. In 1971, the first arcade video game was released. Just 5 years later, in 1976, the first video game was removed from shelves due to violent content. The game Death Race was awarded points to players based on how many gremlins they could run over during the race. When the player struck a gremlin with his car, the gremlin would scream, and then their body would be replaced by a gravestone. The removal of Death Race from shelves marked the beginning of a video game controversy.
Video game violence and its impact on kids.
The issue remained dormant until 1993 when a congressional hearing was held to discuss violence in video games. The hearing focused on two video games, Night Trap and Mortal Kombat. Night Trap was eventually removed from shelves because it was believed to show an effort to trap and kill women, even though the real goal was to save them. Most of the criticisms of the game were taken out of context. The player did not try to trap women. The murders would only occur if the player failed. The second game, Mortal Kombat, was most controversial at the time. This game was a violent fighting simulator featuring realistic characters. The most controversial aspect of this game was the bloody fatalities. Upon victory, the player is allowed to inflict a lethal and gruesome attack on their opponent. In exchange for not removing Mortal Kombat from stores, the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, or ESRB, was formed as a self-regulating organization to assign age and content ratings to video games. One video game that was not discussed in detail at these hearings was Doom. Doom is a first-person shooter where the player takes the role as the space marine Doom Guy and must battle through hordes of demons to stop the invasion from hell. The game was controversial due to the graphic violence and satanic imagery. Retired Lieutenant Colonel and Killology Research Group founder David Grossman labeled the game as a mass murder simulator. In 1999, that comment was very relevant when Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold committed the Columbine High School massacre. The two perpetrators were very avid players of several violent video games, including Doom. Harris went as far to say that the killing would be like playing Doom. The public outcry blamed Doom for this shooting, but in 2008, research featured by the Greater Good Science Center showed that violent video games and school shootings are not closely related. As time passes, our society is more and more willing to accept violent video games. Earlier video games such as Doom and Mortal Kombat are tame compared to popular modern games like Grand Theft Auto, where the goal is to make money by stealing cars, murdering prostitutes, dealing drugs, and shooting police officers. These games are still met with some controversy, but are largely accepted. Although there is a general stigma that violent video games have harmful effects on the thought process and actions of young individuals, there are also a multitude of arguments that don't peg these games as causes of vicious behavior. One of the most important things we must keep in mind when reading statistics is that correlation is not causation. In this case, although studies have concluded that violent video games may have an effect on the thoughts and brain activity of a child, it does not mean it would cause these kids to act upon these impulses. Some studies hypothesize that in reality, it could be other aspects of the video game that cause this hostility. For example, a study in Psychology of Violence, a reliable and well-known research journal, stated that the competitive nature of any type of video game could be another variable to determine the behavior rather than the amount of violence found. Other studies conclude that these violent video games allow for a safe outlet for rage, aggression, and stress. Instead of acting upon these impulses in reality, they can go to a different world to rid their minds of them. Psychology of Popular Media Culture, another research journal, claims that as more people have been exposed to violent video games, serious and deadly assaults have not increased. In fact, the opposite has happened. With the great increase of video game sales, raising 204% from 1994 to 2014, we have also seen a decrease in violent crimes and high school fights by juveniles. In addition to this, world-renowned economist Stephen Levitt, co-author of Freakonomics, says that the time violent people spend playing these video games takes them away from the streets, decreasing the opportunity to physically act. This is named the incapacitation effect. Most surprisingly, there is research within computers and human behavior that shows that violent video games actually foster kindness, civic engagement, and pro-social behavior through the use of multiplayer. Because these players must learn to work together in the video game to win. They learn to use these skills outside of their make-believe world of within the television screen into the real world. Even in the legal world, there is no support that these video games cause violence. In the Supreme Court case Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association, the judges ruled 7-2 that California could not ban violent video games from minors because it violated the First Amendment. Justice Scalia wrote that studies do not prove that violent video games cause minors to act aggressively. In an effort to curtail negative psychological consequences, companies implement age ratings. The Entertainment Software Rating Board is in charge of suggesting what ages are appropriate for said games. The 7 categories are meant to serve as helpful guides for concerned parents. However, it's important to know that these ratings are mere recommendations, which many children tend to ignore. The danger of playing an older video game is that young kids expose themselves to adult themes, such as sex, blood, violence, and controversial language, without understanding how to interpret it. Research studies have been conducted that suggest playing violent video games may increase aggressive behavior and can cause kids to inappropriately resolve anxiety by externalizing it. One of the reasons as to why these video games have such detrimental effects is due to the high perpetualness that they are played. It is rare for a child to play one game and suddenly put his or her controller down. The average 8 to 18-year-old devotes 7.5 hours a day to entertainment media. Another component to consider is the active role video games require. Children aren't passively watching people being blown up or shot. Rather, they are the ones administering these malicious deeds. Video games have revolutionized. It has become an extremely popular social activity among friends and even more so among strangers. Technology has allowed people from all over the world to play one another online and communicate both through text and vocals. Ideally, it seems that this would add a social factor to an isolating game, but oftentimes that's not the case. More commonly, kids use this component as a method of trash talk for the sake of competition. Since this type of interaction is done within a game atmosphere, many fail to acknowledge its harmful effects. With inconsistent results coming from multiple studies, it's hard to come up with a real answer to this controversy. There are many loose relationships tying violent behavior to violent video games, but there is not enough evidence to show that playing violent video games causes violent behavior. We may also see that these games can desensitize the player to violence, but desensitization does not always cause some sort of violent behavior. In the end, playing violent video games may not affect every person the same way. For some, it may be an outlet for their anger, but for most people, it may simply be an enjoyable hobby.